This is History of Sexuality in the U.S., Lecture 2D, Part 3, talking about expansionism during the Reconstruction phase. The Civil War put a bit of a pause on a lot of westward expansion, but we want to understand that the Civil War actually contains some of the most brutal events of what are collectively called the Indian Wars. Massacres of really disturbing and often sexual nature occurred at places like Sand Creek during the Dakota War and at Bosque Redondo on the Dene Territory, all during the Civil War. And in the wake of the war, that militarization, the training of so many troops, the preparation of so much military material, and the advancements in technology from that time meant that these resources could be redirected very easily towards a particularly violent phase of stealing native land. And so we see all over the plains in the Southwest as well as in the Rocky Mountain region throughout the 1860s and 70s an incredible amount of violence. Most of this inflicted by the U.S. military, though certainly local settlers and militias play a role. And it's important to recognize that one of the first opportunities for African American men to serve for the United States after the Civil War was as Buffalo Soldiers, as units that were specifically organized with black men to fight indigenous people. These battles, these conflicts were accompanied by a Homestead Act passed in 1862, also during the war. And this Homestead Act is one of the most incredible handouts that the U.S. government ever created. They gave away land recently stolen from indigenous people to anyone who was present, white and male. And if they were married, they could get twice as much land. This privileges whiteness, it privileges a heterosexual nuclear family, and it's an enormous incentive for settlers to travel from the East Coast out onto the Great Plains and into more and more parts of the country where, again, the military has recently cleared indigenous sovereignty and taken native people from their traditional lands. This expansion begins to reach towards the limits of continental expansion in the 1870s, but the United States, or at least some people within it, have their sights set on more distant targets. We see the United States putting feelers out into the world more and more in the 19th century and increasing after the 1850s, when the United States begins opening up trans-Pacific trade with Japan, begins seizing islands all around the world under the Guano Islands Act, purchases Alaska from the Russian Empire in the 1860s, almost annexes the Dominican Republic, though the Senate rejected the treaty ultimately in 1870, and then in 1875 establishing military bases in Hawaii and Samoa, two places that later at the end of the century are going to be incorporated into the American empire. So that's to say that this manifest destiny, this continental expansion, this anti-indigenous violence is going to continue in new forms and new ways at a more global scale as the century comes to an end. We want to understand that as this is happening, there are changing tropes about indigenous people. And those images of them as fierce and savage begin to be replaced with, in many ways, an equally confining but very different set of images. In 1877, the Nez Perce leader Chief Joseph led his people on a 1,000-mile-long retreat from U.S. cavalry, veterans of the Civil War, who were chasing him from his traditional territories in the area that's now the Idaho, Oregon, Washington border. At the end of this, he gave a famous speech that was republished again and again throughout this country as people began following indigenous people not as these fearsome savages in the darkness, but instead lamentable, pitiable figures. The trope of the disappearing Indian, or the false idea that settlers have that indigenous people were always already dying away, came to dominate images of indigenous people as these wars came to an end and as the ability for indigenous nations to assert their sovereignty through military means became very limited. These tropes are very contradictory. When we see a lot of images of indigenous people, especially of native men, then we might think of as kind of exotically sexy. The muscled, shirtless, ripped, war bonnet wearing, close to nature sort of image of indigenous men begins to come out as, again, we've shifted from this idea of threatening savages to exotic difference. And at the same time, these tropes that say that some indigenous people are sexy say that indigenous people are overall sexless and queer. They're unable to reproduce their nation, to grow their population, or to live what are considered the mandatory nuclear family lifestyle. We'll see in our next unit that a number of other changes are going to be put in place to try to force indigenous people into this nuclear family lifestyle. For the time being, though, we're going to transition to talk about some other evolutions that are happening. So keep watching and keep learning.